Then the next speaker is Paul Cornish, who's, well, you know from the previous panel, but he's director at the Coracle Analysis and chief strategist at the City Forum Public Policy Analysis. And the title of his remarks is International Security Futures. So please, Mr. Cornish.
Thanks very much. Can I begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be some related questions. What should we think when we can have little confidence in the durability of our terms of reference? What should we risk, and against what eventuality, and for what reward? How can we strategize? I'm going to begin by quoting from a book that appeared in July 2017. It was called 2020 World of War. My innate English modesty and reticence prevents me from saying who the author was. But I will say it's a cutting-edge and almost best-selling volume. And here's what I wrote in the last chapter. By way of a passing compliment to Donald Rumsfeld, I wrote this: adaptability is the most convincing way for a future-oriented strategy to meet Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns. You'll all remember all of that. It's not enough to say that since governments do not know how the international security environment will evolve over coming decades, that they can only be expected to prepare for what they do know, or not prepare at all. The lack of foresight is nothing more than a statement of the obvious. Governments have never been able to look into the future, and it's inconceivable that they might recently have discovered how to do so. Strategy has always been a form of organized, active ignorance, and is likely to remain that way. So instead, the challenge lies in governments' capacity, confidence, and courage to cope with uncertainty, to adapt internally, and in conjunction with friends and allies, and to act strategically without or having all the information to hand that they might need or wish. All that we can know of the 21st century security environment is that we must engage with it. Well, so what? I see 21st century international security to be chaotic, and I think it follows in a way that the challenge is to work out how to act counter-chaotically, rather than wait until the chaos settles and goes away. And by chaotic, what I have in mind are those security threats that we've heard about in the last couple of days, and challenges which can be defined in the abstract, but which are largely unpredictable in their source, their timing, and their consequences, and which may or may not reinforce each other either unintentionally or as the result of deliberate collaboration, or indeed unintended consequences of our own planning and reaction. For example, intervention operations that precipitate population displacement, leading in turn to the chronic migration crisis that we've known in Europe for several years. So is it simply all about money? I don't see it that way. I think that arguments about the level, and we've been hearing of them in the last couple of days, about the level and the focus of defense spending displace our attention away from the far deeper problem of the shortage of strategic thought. So I'm going to ask in the next couple of minutes what we can do. How can we go about trying to future-proof national security and defense strategy in the context that we've been talking about here in Leangkollen? And I'm going to offer four very broad principles. The first one I've called here burden sharing, but I'm not getting back to the transatlantic burden. I'm not getting back to the 2% question. I'm talking about domestic burden sharing. Countless speeches on matters of defense and security refer to Adam Smith, the first duty of the sovereign, being that of protecting the society from the violence and invasion of other independent societies. You will have heard this first duty comment a million times. And I think the frequency with which the comment is made or referenced partly explains why it's now got so little rhetorical authority. Familiarity, you might say, breeds contempt. The deeper problem with this line of argument is that it offers such an obvious solution to such a complex problem that actually it by now lacks credibility. If the solution were that simple, then surely we wouldn't be in these difficulties. So I think we have an argument in the Smith argument, the first duty argument, for improving our defense posture that's hinged upon a claim that cannot be taken seriously. And the argument is therefore ignored. Nobody, no government, they'll all stand up and say first duty and so on, then they'll carry on not spending on defense. So clearly it's not working. And I think there's a more reasonable and a much less disposable version of the argument that should be made in any case. Smith's first duty, he said, can be performed only by means of a military force. That's fine. But he then also goes on to say that that duty grows gradually more and more expensive as the society advances in civilization. And that led him to the following comment, which I think is critically important, but it's not often mentioned. In a civilized society, he wrote, as the soldiers are maintained altogether by the labor of those who are not soldiers, the number of the former can never exceed what the latter can maintain, over and above maintaining, in a manner suitable to their respective stations, both themselves and the other officers of government and law whom they are obliged to maintain. So for Smith, I think there's very clearly something prior to that first duty, and that is society itself. In other words, a modern society which paid insufficient attention to its financial well-being, to the stability of its economy, to its industrial capacity, and perhaps even to its cultural cohesion, all of those things would scarcely qualify as a society. It wouldn't be worth defending, and it could probably not afford to do so in any case. So I suggest that Smith's first duty is actually to achieve security and defence within the means available. And this is key, without beggaring the economy completely and undermining the general welfare, if you like. So I argue for a more nuanced and a more credible version of Smith's first duty argument. And I don't mean that we can simply abandon Smith altogether and move on the grounds that the argument is, as I suggested at the beginning, simplistic and exaggerated and so on and so forth, and take the opposite approach, whereby we assume that we can have welfare and society without security. If we want to live in a society with all that means, then surely the point is, I think, that defence of society should be no more or less important than other areas of public spending: health, social care, transport, education, you name it. And it should not be allowed to become an afterthought, which I think does happen too often, paradoxically, in spite of the fact that we hear the first duty argument all the time. All of these functions define society. All of them are a draw upon a healthy economy, and all of them, I think, should feel any burden of economic difficulty. So that's the domestic burden sharing point. Second point is what I called here liquid strategy. Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, produced a neat little book, Liquid Times, Living in an Age of Uncertainty, and he wrote of what he called a liquid phase of modernity, social forms, which he defined as structures that limit individual choices, institutions that guard repetitions of routine, patterns of acceptable behavior, can no longer and are not expected to keep their shape for long because they decompose and melt faster than the time it takes for them, to cast them, and once they are cast, for them to set. Now, that's a pretty dismal vision if you happen to be a government official working in strategy and security and defence and are used to the idea of alliances lasting for several decades, for example. I think, though, something like liquid strategy is what we need. I know that equipment procurement, personnel recruitment, military training programs, all of these things cannot be turned on a sixpence or a euro cent, if you like. And they can't be redirected in a flash to the latest emerging security challenge. And so the notion of liquid strategy flowing with ease from one crisis to another is probably a bit far-fetched. I accept that. But I wonder whether we can be a little bit more liquid by thinking in terms of strategic latency, which is my third point. Strategic latency is generally associated with technological innovation and development. Confronting an uncertain future, armed forces will require a capability delta, we're all familiar with this idea, as wide as we can make it or afford it. But that doesn't just mean multi-role equipment, in my view, and platforms and so on. I think it also means that we'll need agile, multi-role politico-military minds. As we said, I think, earlier in the conference, many of these challenges are not innately or necessarily or exclusively military. So strategic latency should make it possible for defence to think beyond the short term, to anticipate plausible strategic futures, and to ensure that the long-range capability plan is not geared too tightly to relatively short term, in other words, about 5 years of a risk picture. In the UK, we had for some time so many people in authority in defence and security saying that the future will be like Afghanistan. It'll be desert combat. It'll be this. It was so fixed on the current experience. So my argument is that strategic latency is an argument for national strategic resilience, for maintaining a balanced mix of armed forces, even though, or perhaps actually because, such a force posture might not appear consistent with a compressed and very foreshortened outlook on national defence. And they do tend to be around the 5-year bracket. It's a broad mix of military capabilities and ideas seen as a long-term asset rather than a short-term liability. And finally, the culture of innovation, my fourth point. We need to treat innovation as a general strategic output capability in its own right, in which appropriate investment should be made. I'm sure, as in Norway, as in all other countries across NATO and the EU, there's this running argument about levels of spending on innovation, R&D, S&T, and so on. We need to do that rather than depend upon innovation as a specific strategic input capability, a tailored, innovative response, if you like, that we develop as the need arises. I think we have to move away from a sort of cause and effect, linear, reactive mentality in which government and the strategic establishment allow themselves the time to innovate in order to solve a given security problem as it arises. Instead, innovation has to be prospective. Of course it does. That's the definition in a way of innovation. So that the strategic community in the UK or wherever else is culturally, technologically, economically positioned to anticipate a security problem before it arises, or at least to identify the challenge at its earliest formative stage and to deal with it effectively at pace. Finally, I'll finish. Resources are critical to any strategic, operational, or tactical assessment and decision. Of course they are. We all know that. You'll never find a military person who's got a brain in his or her head saying that resources don't matter. In military planning, it's the thing that comes after your assessment of the enemy. You've got to know what it's such an obvious thing, an obvious point to make. So nobody, I think, could seriously argue that resources are infinite or they don't matter, unless perhaps we happen to have a huge flush of money at a certain point, or that the Defence Ministry should get whatever it needs whenever it calls for it, unless perhaps there's a national emergency of some sort. But I'm going to make my finishing point really is that affordability is not the same as resources. And I think the problem with affordability, again, another term that we have a lot in the UK debate, is that it's a device that carries an awful lot of baggage. Implicit in the term is the, I think, mistaken idea that the value of the commodity or service in question, in this case, defence and security, is absolute and fixed. But of course it isn't. It's relative. It's determined by a host of variables, including threat. And the idea of relative value, I think, must be the same for all areas of policy, coming back to my burden sharing point, education and wealth and health and so on. So why do we allow the assumption that the value of defence is somehow fixed, while all these other functions of society are allowed to float, to ebb and to flow? The problem, I think, is that threat is more potential or latent than actual and can occur with little or no warning. So I think we need strategy to be adaptable and liquid or latent. I don't have any evidence at all for this, none whatsoever. There are no data, and I think this is what makes this argument critically important and such a hard one to make. It's a qualitative argument for the value of defence as an output, rather than a quantitative argument against the cost of defence as an input. But I think we have to make this argument, otherwise we can't have anything like a respectable, resource-backed national strategy to deal with international security challenges.